Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our participants and our online audience on behalf of the Helen Suzman Foundation. My name is Lorette Lowe-Besaidnout, and I will be your facilitator for this webinar. I am a consultant with the Helen Suzman Foundation, but I've also been a legal advisor to the Minister of Correctional Services for the years 2009 to 2012. At that stage, of course, it was Judge Dion Herter van Zyl who was the inspecting judge. We kick off this year as the Helen Suzman Foundation with this webinar focusing on a topic that is inspired by the life and work of our patron, Ms. Helen Suzman. She is often credited with visiting political prisoners during the height of apartheid. Her visits to Robben Island and elsewhere in the country did not only result in the improvement of prison conditions for political prisoners, but also often for the general prison population. It is now 21 years since President Mbeki appointed the Commission of Inquiry into alleged incidents of corruption, maladministration, violence, or intimidation in the Department of Correctional Services. We, of course, know this commission as the Jali Commission. The Jali Commission noted and concluded at the time, amongst others, that the issue of overcrowding can clearly be regarded as a state violation of the basic human rights of prisoners, which is unconstitutional and cannot be condoned in our new democracy. Now jump ahead to 2026, and the Helen Suzman Foundation is still deeply concerned by the fact that this unconstitutional and untenable situation caused by overcrowding in our correctional facilities continue unabated. I mean, if I just look at the statistics for last year when the department presented in the Portfolio Committee in Parliament, they reported an increase in overcrowding from the year 23 to 24 from 48% to 55% for the financial year 24 to 25. We have therefore resolved as the foundation to call together the experts who I have the honor of introducing just now within the field of correctional services, to host this webinar to evaluate the steps that we've taken or not taken over the years to address overcrowding in South Africa's correctional facilities. The systemic causes of overcrowding, as identified more than 21 years ago by the Jali Commission, seems to persist until today. And to break this cycle, we need novice and practical steps to be considered. And we hope some of those ideas will come forward from this webinar that can be taken forward not only by us as a foundation, but by other civil society stakeholders working hand in hand with role players like the inspecting judge. It therefore gives me a great honor now to introduce our speakers for this webinar. We are honored to be joined by the newly appointed inspecting judge for correctional centers, Judge Lee Bozalek. Judge Bozalek served for 18 years as a judge in the Western Cape High Court, where he delivered a number of significant judgments in diverse areas of the law. Throughout his judicial career, Judge Bozalek has maintained a sustained and active interest in the conditions within correctional centers. He frequently conducted unannounced inspections and produced reports addressing conditions of detention. This long-standing engagement with correctional oversight and human rights now underpins his role as inspecting judge. And especially us as a foundation look forward to working with you, Judge, going forward on your tenure as inspecting judge. We are also delighted this afternoon to be joined by Professor Thabiso Matshaba, who is a professor of corrections management in the School of Criminal Justice at UNISA. Professor Matshaba's work focuses on the effectiveness of education and skills development as tools for social transformation, particularly within the marginalized and the correctional services settings. He has an extensive publication record within the field of corrections. And finally, I would like to welcome Ms. Doreen Gora. Ms. Gora is a senior program officer at Just Detention International in South Africa. She trains corrections officers and other stakeholders, assists in the coordination of civil society networks to uphold detainee rights, conducts research and advocacy, and supports survivors of sexual violence in detention. Each of our distinguished guests will this afternoon be given a period of approximately 10 minutes to provide their inputs on this very important topic, whereafter I will open up the platform to our YouTube audience, online audience, to please comment on the discussion, pose questions, and we will try to engage with you as much as the technology allows us. It now gives me a great honor to introduce Judge Bozalek to please share with us your views as newly appointed inspecting judge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bezuidenhout, and greetings to everyone listening to this webinar and to my fellow panelists. Thank you for the invitation to address the questions which you've raised. I wouldn't regard myself as an expert on the question of overcrowding, but I am at this early stage of my career, but I am making it my business to get as well informed as possible. To jump straight into the matter, overcrowding has long plagued South Africa's prisons. It was a defining feature of apartheid prisons due to the mass criminalization of black South Africans under racially discriminatory laws. So when democracy came along in 1994, the government did begin to try and reform the criminal justice system and build a system based on human dignity, reform and rehabilitation. However, I'm not sure, in fact, I am sure that our prison system is not living up to these aspirations, with inmates serving long punitive sentences in harsh conditions. And a recurring problem within the system, as has been repeatedly pointed out by previous inspecting judges and other stakeholders, is overcrowding. Statistics illustrate this. South Africa has the largest prison population in Africa and the 12th largest prison population in the world. Presently, our daily prison population is of the order of 167,000 detainees. As of July last year, our prison system is 56% over capacity. But in reality, this masks a much more serious problem, because that's an average, and you can go to facilities where overcrowding is at 200 or 300, even 300%. In late December, together with my predecessor, we visited the Pollsmoor Women's Correctional Center in Cape Town, and specifically the Remand Center. And there we inspected 2 cells and found overcrowding levels at 254%. And in practical terms, what we were shown a cell which was empty because the inmates were having their daily exercise period, which was supposed to house, in terms of the DCS provisions, 54 persons. And at 54, believe you me, that would have been a squeeze. But it was in fact housing 86 women in bunks, one on top of the other, jammed together, some people having to sleep on the floors, and all these 86 people in the cell, maybe 21 hours out of 24, sharing one toilet and one shower. We then went to another cell where the inmates were inside, and it was literally people jammed in there like sardines. So this is definitely inhumane conditions, and a report was drawn up and sent off to various authorities. Overcrowding has wide-ranging and harmful consequences. It undermines rehabilitation efforts, comes at a huge cost to the state, it harms health and education systems, and it obviously accelerates the spread of disease. It also results in inadequate facilities, inhumane living conditions, and shortages of basic supplies, and the erosion of fundamental human rights. Now, Dr. Bezuidenhout has referred to the Jali Commission. An entire chapter of that report, when it was produced in 2005, was devoted to overcrowding. And as you have mentioned, it found that overcrowding constitutes a violation of the basic human rights of prisoners, which cannot be condoned. The report attributed overcrowding in our prisons to a range of factors, including mismanagement, incompetence, failure to use statutory remedies, stringent bail laws and parole regimes, and the use of mandatory minimums in sentencing. Amongst the recommendations which the Commission made to alleviate the problem was that sentenced inmates in overcrowded facilities be moved to less crowded facilities, that the President's The president's amnesty power should be used more frequently to reduce overcrowding. That the Department of Safety and Security should bear the costs of remand detainees, i.e. detainees who are awaiting trial, since this would serve as an incentive for the police to not arrest individuals until they have properly investigated the complaint or the matter. Another recommendation was that the department should reintroduce the system of goal returns. Under this system, if remand detainees were incarcerated for a long time, the judge could call on the Director of Public Prosecutions to explain why the trial had not been finalized, and after receiving an explanation, either set the matter down on an expedited basis for trial or consider bail. This recommendation has been incorporated in the Correctional Services Act, but whether it's working to its full potential is another question, and I'll come back to it. Another recommendation was that the parole board should consider overcrowding when it deals with parole applications. Now, overcrowding is driven by numerous factors, but there are many workable solutions to reduce it. Many of these have been pointed out by previous inspecting judges and other stakeholders. I'll touch on some of these briefly. These are ideas which have been widely disseminated and shared by stakeholders, and they're certainly not my original suggestions. In fact, you will find them handily collected in a book which I would strongly recommend and would urge everyone to read, and that's the book by my predecessor, Justice Cameron. Here we have it, Behind Prison Walls, Unlocking a Safer South Africa, which touches on overcrowding and a whole range of other issues relating to the whole correctional service environment and the criminal justice system. And in that book, he was assisted by his fellow co-authors, Rebecca Gore and Sahela Surajpal. So amongst these possible solutions are: one, improving policing and crime intelligence. The evidence demonstrates that the most effective deterrent to crime is the certainty of being caught. However, in the 2023-24 year, almost 90% of murders went unpunished. Therefore, there should be much greater emphasis on strengthening police and crime intelligence to reduce crime levels, thus alleviating the pressure on the prison system. I think we've all read over the last couple of years how the crime intelligence system has been ravaged by political infighting. We also need to ensure, as I've already alluded to, that police do not make arrests without conducting a thorough prosecution-led investigation. An arrest first, investigate later approach has resulted in a huge disjuncture between arrests and convictions, leading to a significant number of remand detainees needlessly clogging up the system. Of the 167,000 persons presently in our prison population, some 60,000 of them are awaiting trial prisoners. And in some cases, the delays in the finalization of their cases, how long they have been in prison, can stretch to 2, 3, 4, and even 5 years. So some figures here: between April 23 and March 24, SAPS recorded 27,590 murder cases. But during this period, there were some 16,000 arrests for murder. But despite this, the NPA only finalized just under 4,000 murder cases, of which about 3,000 resulted in convictions. Another area of reform, a solution, would be bail reform. Many remand detainees are in prison merely because they cannot afford relatively small bail amounts. So this obviously exacerbates overcrowding. In June 2025, JICS recorded that there were 2,271 remandees who could not afford bail of less than R1,000. So some solutions here is that we can move away from the cash bail system and implement non-monetary bail conditions instead. There are also private initiatives. The JICS Bail Fund is an extra institutional pilot project. The idea behind it that it would advance bail of less than R1,000 to those persons in deserving cases who cannot afford to pay the bail. It seems too, in this regard, that too many inmates, I'm talking now about the parole system, and this is a system which I think also drastically needs reform. The system presently is somewhat slow, inefficient, and overburdened. Parole boards are sometimes insufficiently qualified, and the decisions which it makes are often inconsistent. Too many inmates unsuitable for parole seem to be released without sufficient monitoring, and too few who deserve to be released on parole are actually released. Of particular concern, and this needs to be highlighted, is the parole system for lifers. In terms of Section 78 of the Correctional Services Act, the Minister has the ultimate decision-making power in respect of parole for inmates serving life sentences, which, as most of you will know, is a 25-year sentence. This has caused a massive backlog within the system and gives the Minister a huge degree of discretion in granting parole, but it renders parole decisions of lifers vulnerable to a minister's personal inclinations or philosophy and to political pressures. By way of example, towards the end of 2024, our current minister, Dr. Groenewald, rejected more than 90% of the parole applications approved by the National Council for Correctional Services, and that is a judge-led body. Solutions in this regard, I would suggest, would be that the National Council for Correctional Services should make the final decision on lifer parole, subject to a more limited ministerial veto to be exercised within a given time frame. Another area of reform would be that the very important system of parole should be the subject of a separate piece of legislation to ensure transparency, efficiency, and consistency. Another area of reform is mandatory minimum sentences, and I think it's high time that we abolished mandatory minimum sentences and move towards the sentencing guidelines that the South African Law Commission suggested many decades ago. Many leading scholars have emphasized that minimum sentences are not fit for purposes. They do not result in increased deterrence, rehabilitation, or incapacitation. A very revealing statistic in this regard is that in 1996, there were 518 inmates serving life sentences. But by March 2024, with 25 or 30 years of minimum sentences, that number reached 18,795 persons serving a life sentence. That is a 36-fold increase. Another area to look at is non-custodial sentencing, which has many benefits and will help ease prison overcrowding. However, for these to be effective, the system will have to introduce proper monitoring of such persons, and it needs to be adequately resourced in that regard. There are statutory and legal remedies on the books to deal with overcrowding, whereby the courts can step in and release persons on application by the Department of Correctional Services, and also where someone has spent more than 2 years in prison and is still on remand. Now, unfortunately, even though these remedies exist, the department reported that only 26.25 of its applications under the Correctional Services Act were successful, and a mere 2.83 under the provisions in the Criminal Procedure Act were successful. So the apparent judicial reluctance to embrace these remedies is regrettable, and one needs more attention in that regard. Courts can also be used to reduce overcrowding. There was a 2017 Western Cape High Court case which instructed the department to reduce the overcrowding in the Pollsmoor Remand Detention Facility, and a structural interdict was granted. But however, one has to question the effectiveness of such orders, since the problem remains at Pollsmoor Remand detention facility, and one wonders whether this doesn't just shift the problem elsewhere, and that type of remedy doesn't really tackle the root cause of overcrowding. We should also look at decriminalization of certain offences such as sex work and drug use, which is often these sentences are ineffective and counterproductive, and place an unnecessary burden on the criminal justice system and on the prison system. One can also possibly consider increasing public awareness of overcrowding. I know that there's limited sympathy in many quarters for prison reform, and I think the issue of overcrowding is quite well known, but when you see it in reality, the way people are being forced to spend their sentences, the conditions, any notion of a prison sentence being akin to a stay in a state-sponsored hotel is just absolutely without any foundation whatsoever. It goes without saying that building more prisons is not the answer to the problem. Experience has shown worldwide, the more prisons you build, the more they quickly fill up. So that would never be something which I could recommend, or JIX could recommend. The one caveat I do want to introduce there is that on inspections, one sees that the conditions of prisons, the conditions of cells is often dire, and one would be completely in support of spending money to improve conditions, keep conditions keep the facilities in a decent condition. But building more prisons is I would suggest the dead end. So that, in a nutshell, is what I believe could be done to reduce overcrowding, reducing unnecessary arrests, improving policing and crime intelligence, addressing unaffordable bail, reforming the parole system, addressing trial delays, the use of non-custodial sentencing options to a much greater degree, and reducing the use of mandatory minimums in sentencing. So we need to have a push towards a more systemic reaction towards introducing these solutions and pushing them further, rather than merely paying lip service to this and going on year after year, decade after decade, with an ever-increasing overcrowding problem. Thank you very much. I've probably used more than my 10 minutes. I apologize for that.
No, thank you very much, Judge Bozalek, for those insightful comments, especially since you focus strongly on reform solutions, and I will engage with a few of them and around what you've said a bit later, but let's first get inputs from our whole panel. I'd like to ask Professor Machaba, you've got a presentation that you'd like to put up for us?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, you can put a presentation for me.
Chanel will put it up now. It's just behind this.
Thank you.
There.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Bezenhout, and thanks to Helen Suzman Foundation for the invite. From the last 21 years, I do not think that there is much progress made on the fight against overcrowding. And in my presentation, I'm going to discuss some key reasons for overcrowding in South African Correctional Center currently. And some of the issues that will be discussed on the presentation have been covered by the judge. Thank you very much, Judge. And overcrowding continues to plague South African correctional centers because it is not caused by a single failure. There's a multiple failure on this issue. And the other aspect is a systematic weakness across the criminal justice system. And it starts from the policing to courts, and it ends up into correctional centers. So the key factors, there are many factors, but I'm going to discuss some selected factors. The first one will be a high number of remand or awaiting trial detainee in our correctional center, longer sentences as indicated by the judge for serious and violent crime in South Africa, high recidivism rate linked to crime cycle in our correctional center, strain in criminal justice institution, high crime rate and socio-economic inequalities is one of the contributing factors for overcrowding. And finally, we'll briefly look at the incarceration of foreign inmates in South African correctional centers. Regarding the high numbers of remand detainees in our correctional centers, as the judge indicated, there's a lot of court backlogs, whereby it takes time and a lot of delays and postponements during the trials. And in some particular cases, you'll find out this particular accused doesn't have specific amount of money to pay, or it doesn't have a bail. So they have to be detained in our correctional centers. And as indicated, inability to afford bail. We've got whereby some of the accused, they have to pay bail starting from 1,000 rand per rand. But unfortunately, because they cannot afford that, they have to be in our correctional services, including for just petty offenses, minor offenses. And we are having high case volume that result into slow investigation and trials. Truly speaking, as indicated, most of the investigating officers, they are having a high volume of cases to be solved. In some particular cases, we'll find one investigating officer with plus or minus 50 cases to be solved. So it takes time and it affects our center population. Serious offenses often lead to denial of bail. So we can move to the longer sentences, minimum sentence legislation. The judges provide us with the background of that. But in South Africa, we are having a high crime rate, especially violent crimes. And this has led to punitive sentencing framework. As indicated, mandatory minimum sentencing has increased the sentencing length in South Africa. That is why we've got a population of inmates who are serving long sentences. The judge also indicated the issue of parole board. They are reluctant to grant parole for violent offenders. And there's a public concern on that because in some cases, there's this political interest in particular cases. So it is difficult for parole boards to take the decision on that. And limited use of alternative sentences, community services, correctional supervision and fines. Our judges are so reluctant to provide such sentences, especially for petty offenses. And that's indicated public and political pressure also encourage harsher penalties. If the case is at the public interest, the community think that they need to put a pressure on the court of law so that a particular perpetrator can get a longer sentence because this case is at public interest. And the other issue, as I finalize this slide, longer sentences reduce turnover and increase population density. So the more we are having the judgment of longer sentences, it will be difficult for us to fight against present overcrowding. And the other issue is high recidivism rate linked to crime cycles. Here we can look at socioeconomic issues. They also increase reoffending. This one needs a specific time so that we can look at it as a specific issue that the Department of Correctional Services is facing. It is estimated that 55 to 95% of inmates that have been released, they went back to prison committing newer crimes or breaking the parole condition. And in our correctional center, based on overcrowding, we are having limited rehabilitation during incarceration. And the other aspect is the lack of professional staff members in our correctional psychologists and social work. In some particular cases, we'll find one psychologist versus 500 offenders, and it is highly impossible that every offender will go through psychological services program. And at the other side, we are having weak reintegration support after the release. The support is basically from our families. The families still stigmatize people who are coming from prison, and most of the inmates do not get a support either from the families or the friends after incarceration. And one final issue is the stigma, the labeling theory, whereby each and every time a person that is coming from correctional center, no matter whether he has been rehabilitated, is still stigmatized to a criminality. So it is difficult for them to cope within our society. And we can move to strain on criminal justice institution. I touch on this. A high crime rate in South Africa overwhelms the entire justice chain. Currently, it is estimated that plus or minus 1 million cases are within our courts. You can just imagine if, for instance, 50% of those cases, the perpetrator, they found guilty, which means that we might have plus or minus 150,000 people who will go direct to our prisons. So the only way to fight overcrowding in South Africa is to fight against crime. If we fight against crime, there will never be these numbers in our correctional centers. And the other issue, SAPS, courts and correctional services operate under pressure. Most of our correctional centers, as indicated by the judge, are overcrowded. And in some instances, it's difficult for correctional officers to work under those circumstances. And the delays and ineffectiveness of increased detention duration is one of the issues. And there's a weak interdepartmental coordination that worsen the congestion in criminal justice system. We need to have integrated criminal justice system that can be able to trace the movements of inmates into the system and the movement out of the system. This will be able to assist us at the other side to evaluate whether this offender A was released on parole before, and then are we going to consider him for parole for the second time, third time, and the fourth time, because there are multiple offenders who receive more than 9 parole with different kind of crime committed. And high crime rate, the judge touched on this issue, and I also touched on issues, but let us look at the issue of inequality. South Africa have high unemployment rate. Currently, it is estimated that more than 60% of young people in South Africa are unemployed. There's a rife poverty. But at the end of the day, we don't have to use poverty as an excuse to commit crime. But the reality is that we are in equal state, whereby the poor of the poorest are the last link of the society, and the rich of the richest become at the top of the society. So the issue of inconsistency in the lifestyle, poverty, and employment is one of the contributing factors to incarceration in South Africa, and then it affects the correctional center population. Limited access to education and skills development. Our country is I think that we are in a point whereby we are collapsing, the infrastructure is collapsing. Now we've got the floods around Limpopo. South Africa needs vocational training, and these trainings can be implemented in correctional center so that we can be able to work on our infrastructure. There's a rife of substance abuse in South Africa. Young people, they are using drugs, and the gang is one of the problems that we are facing in our community. And I think that this is one of the burning issues that I want us in future to focus on. Incarceration of foreign inmates in South African Correctional Center. South Africa is experiencing a problem of mass foreigners that came throughout our border illegally. So it was estimated that plus or minus 20 million people, foreigners, are part of South Africa today. And this have an impact on the present population. For example, 26 to 27,000 foreign nationals are incarcerated in South African Correctional Center. And this makes 10% of the overall population. This population of foreign offenders is even higher than the female incarceration in South Africa. For example, this is a burning issue. We've got 690 foreigners who are serving life sentences. And the sad part of it is about plus or minus 480 per day to detain one offenders. You can just imagine if these offenders are going to get a parole after 20 years, How many millions will be we spending on this foreign inmates? And plus or minus 12,037 foreign nationals are in our remand detention center and our waiting trial centers. And these figures show that foreign nationals represent substantial subset of South African prison population, often between 10 to 15% or more of total inmates. So are we saying we are going to let these people to be with us for the next coming 20 years? Or are we going to make a recommendation that these foreign offenders that are within our correctional centers, we have to take them home so that their countries can take the responsibility? I think that this is a burning issue that needs a proper discussion and individual discussion. Program director, my closing remark: overcrowding continues to be a plague South African correctional centers because it is not caused by single failure. I indicated that in the beginning of my presentation, but by systematic weakness across criminal justice. Crime in South Africa has a direct, indirect, cumulative impact on present correctional center overcrowding. And the relationship is not linear. High crime interacts with policing practice. It affects our policing on daily basis. It affects our courts on daily basis. It also affects our sentencing pattern. We can say, let's scrap the minimum sentencing legislation, but it is clear in South Africa, people are committing serious crime. We like it or not, there must be a harsher crime for someone who commits multiple murder. There must be a harsher crime for someone who is serial killer. And the other socioeconomic issue condition, South Africa, we need to pay special attention to this. There's imbalance indicated in South Africa, whereby the poor of the poorest, they become poor, and the richer, they become richer. All these factors that I indicate intensify congestions in our correctional centers. Dr. Bezendate, I think that this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mashaba, for that grim reality and for the proposals that you've made on which we can engage a little bit more. But first, we hand over to Ms. Gora for her inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bazadenhit, and thank you to the Helen Suzman Foundation for organizing this important webinar and the invitation to be on the panel. So many points of my presentation have already been touched on by the inspecting judge and the professor as well, but they do bear repeating nevertheless for emphasis, I suppose, because I think a lot of it is really important. But before I get into my presentation, just a little bit of a background about our organization, Just Detention International South Africa, or JDISA for short, which is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention. We envision a system of justice that centers dignity, healing, and restoration for everyone. To achieve this vision, we have 3 core goals that we work with or work around. And the first one is to build government accountability and capacity to address sexual abuse in places of detention. 2, we transform the damaging and stigmatizing attitudes about people in prisons and other closed settings, as well as sexual abuse in detention. And 3, we work to build survivor support as well as their empowerment. Our work has been and continues to be guided by the experiences of survivors because they know how to end sexual abuse in places of deprivation of liberty. All of our work must continue to uplift, be informed by, and honor these courageous people. So although it's true that not all correctional facilities in the country battle with overcrowding, a significant number of them do, as has been highlighted or indicated by the inspecting judge as well as the professor. Various things can be attributed to this phenomenon, including the country's prevailing punishment-centered response to crime and its over-reliance on custodial measures, the legacies of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid, via the hyper-criminalization of racialized people, including documented and undocumented migrants, high levels of unemployment and socioeconomic inequality and marginalization of impoverished and racialized persons, as well as the heightened likelihood of said persons experiencing longer periods of pretrial detention and or receiving longer or life sentences. Similarly, in light of the country's high recidivism rates, poor rehabilitation and reintegration programs, cis heteronormative patriarchy, unacknowledged and unaddressed individual, collective, and often intergenerational trauma, and underserviced mental health needs, especially in the communities a lot of incarcerated people come from and often return to, have a compounding effect on overcrowding as well. In addition, overcrowding can impact the quality, delivery, and success of rehabilitation, education, and training programs, making overcrowding and recidivism mutually reinforcing. The unacceptably high number of people in awaiting trial detention, whose conditions are arguably worse oftentimes than those in the sentence section of prisons, is another major contributing factor to the high levels of overcrowding in prisons. Not only is the prolonged stay in detention facilities by those awaiting trial contributing to overcrowding and inhumane conditions, but the likelihood of the ones in pre-trial detention for non-violent or minor offenses due to failure to afford bail or delays in court procedures, possibly ending up with additional offenses and or escalation in the type of offending as a result of their own victimization or the victimization of others while incarcerated goes up significantly. Overcrowded and under-resourced facilities are also more difficult to manage and often struggle to meet the basic needs of individuals, including the provision of healthcare, safety, food and water, education programs, due to inadequate resources and capacity. Such stressful conditions also negatively impact staff's own safety and wellness. Overcrowding is a serious problem as it undermines safety and security in correctional centers, leading to the increased risk of stress, mental and physical health problems, as well as violence, including sexual gender-based violence, as well as increased risk of self-injury or deaths by suicide, increased drug use, and heightened tensions between incarcerated persons. All this can be attributed to extended periods in lockup with inadequate monitoring or access to assistance in the event of an emergency. Because our organization works specifically to address sexual, as well as to some degree, general violence and torture in prisons, overcrowding is a major concern for us. As I mentioned before, safety and security in prisons is significantly undermined when the facility is overcrowded and as is usually the case, understaffed. For example, the proper and appropriate assignment of incarcerated persons to cells is one of the main ways of ensuring the safety and wellness of incarcerated persons in general, but especially those who face additional barriers to safety and care because of inadequate or unfair or discriminatory systems. For example, members of the LGBTIQ+ community, persons with physical and or mental disabilities or disorders, young people or older persons, first-timers or persons incarcerated for non-violent offenses, foreign nationals, etc. Overcrowding presents a challenge to ensuring that if this takes place efficiently and always. One of the brave survivors we work with, Tsakani Mutsweni, was raped as a juvenile incarcerated person by an adult incarcerated person who was illegally placed with him in a single cell. As stipulated by the Nelson Mandela rules, if sleeping accommodation is in individual cells or rooms, each prisoner shall occupy by night a cell or room by him or herself. If for special reasons, such as temporary overcrowding, it becomes necessary for the Central Prison Administration to make an exception to this rule, it is not desirable to have 2 prisoners in a cell or room. Additionally, if dormitories are used, they shall be occupied by prisoners carefully selected as being suitable to associate with one another in those conditions, and regular supervision is required. Overcrowding makes this near impossible. At JDISA, we believe we all have a responsibility to challenge our deeply held beliefs on how to create safe and equitable communities. This requires us to be courageous and creative in our thinking about what justice is, which is why we advocate for decarceration and getting the various clusters of the criminal legal system, such as the South African Police Service, the National Prosecuting Authority, the judiciary, corrections, and even Home Affairs, to start moving away from the current heavy reliance on custodial measures as the primary approach to dealing with crime, especially non-violent and minor offenses, including immigration-related offenses. A lot of these offenses would be better addressed by other already existing and arguably more effective interventions like diversion programs, diversion to accessible and quality mental health and psychosocial and rehabilitative services, economic empowerment programs, and support in accessing relevant services, for example, as well as culturally sensitive and centered restorative justice programs. Additionally, the government needs to urgently decriminalize certain offenses, as already been mentioned by the inspecting judge, such as petty offenses, as well as sex work and drug use, and ensure equitable access to bail for indigent persons. Judges and magistrates should not only be encouraged to conduct regular visits to prisons to monitor the treatment of incarcerated people, but they should also take a page from their peers in Malawi and Ghana and conduct mobile or camp courts in the centers for minor offenses. This will help to greatly reduce overcrowding, particularly in pre-trial detention. All the relevant government departments must meet their mandates and make available the necessary resources and capacity for urgent repairs and renovation or refurbishing of existing and dilapidated infrastructure, not to build more prisons, but to prepare and refurbish repair and refurbish or upgrade the existing prisons with regular and make sure that regular quality maintenance follows thereafter. Lastly, government needs to investigate the effectiveness of its current minimum sentences strategy, as well as to prioritize a restorative justice-informed parole system reform process. To quote the former inspecting judge, Edwin Cameron, minimum sentences are poorly thought out, misdirected, hugely costly, and above all, ineffective way of punishing criminals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gora. Thank you very much to all our participants. I will just quickly read some of the comments we received online. They're mostly comments. There's just one question or two questions I see, supporting what has been said by the presentations. I must also say that in summary, I can see a thread of overlap greatly from identifying the causes of overcrowding and the solutions thereto. And it's something I'd like to come back in my concluding remarks just now as to the way forward on some of these issues, since we seem to understand them so well from all the years that it's been reported. But just to say, online, people support the idea of moving away from monetary bail policies because overcrowding is caused by individuals who can't afford it, expand non-custodial sentences to minor offenders, first fight the fight against crime. And then a question posed, is there a possibility to have corporates contribute to the bail funds? We've mentioned here, I think it's referring to the JICS bail fund, or in partnership with the private sector. And yeah, then just a more community education probably in the fight against crime, but I will leave it at that. I don't think we necessarily have to answer the question. Maybe just JICS could indicate whether you are looking at reaching out to corporates and how other civil society organizations could assist you in building up the bail fund, as that is maybe a low-hanging fruit, which is practical. Since we're pressured for time and it's such a heavy topic, I would just like to, as a final question to each of the panelists, starting with you, Judge, just maybe to say, in your view, if a civil society would like to embark on this road with you and see how, I mean, like I've said, from your presentations, it's very clear there's a lot of overlap, mentioning minimum sentences in each presentation, mentioning the fact that there must be cooperation between the JCPS role players. It can't just be that we talk about DCS. It has to be that you involve all the role players from SAPS, how they arrest, MPA, the judges. I mean, judges being mentioned here, you being a judge yourself, engaging maybe with the Office of the Chief Justice to make judges aware of the provisions which have been put there to get the remand detainee numbers down. And if we look at the success rate of that, it's 1%. So DCS, even if they take the cases back to court to say reconsider, it's not being successful. Why? Is it because of the kind of cases, or just because judges are reluctant to engage on it maybe? So there's maybe a role for judges. But so my question, let me just be succinct on this and say my question is basically each of the presenters, what role do you see civil society organizations like the foundation playing in addressing this ongoing issue of unconstitutionality faced with the overcrowding of our correctional centers, which impacts on rehabilitation and reoffending, which is, I think, maybe a message we can work on getting out to the public by making it clear that it's not just about the awful conditions in which people are detained, it's also that you can't rehabilitate people, which leads to reoffending if they're just released back into the population. But those are just my remarks. I hand over to you, Judge Bozalek. Thank you. Judge, I think you're muted. I cannot hear you.
I started off by saying you broke up a little bit there, but I think I get the gist of what you're saying, and how I wanted to respond is that there's definitely a role for civil society in pursuing all or some of these initiatives. For example, in the area of mandatory minimum sentences, I think every civil organization which has an interest in this area should be mounting pressure on the Department of Justice, on the government to review this, because I think it's a huge cause of overcrowding, and its ineffectiveness is so damning that why we are still sentencing, taking away the court's discretion to sentence appropriately is rather mystifying to me, other than the obvious reason, which is that it's an easy political solution to say to the populace, we've got very strict sentences for this offense and that offense. But the more serious question is, why are our detection rates and conviction rates so low? Secondly, I wanted to say that your point about this is not simply a DCS problem. There's a whole chain here, and all aspects, all the links in the chain have to be evaluated and improved. It starts with the causes of crime. That's a huge problem which will take decades to alleviate as we mature as a society. Then there comes the SAPS. Yes, overwhelmed, but they can do a lot better as far as I'm concerned, rather than just arresting people, letting them languish in prisons for years on end. And then, of course, you have the court system. They also are probably overburdened, but more needs to go into that to ensure that trials have to be completed within a certain amount of time, or else people have to be released. Then a slightly different aspect, as I said, the question of bail. We do have this pilot project going, and at the moment, the funding which we have secured when the project kicks in fully is now mainly from overseas funder. But if the trial project is successful and it can be rolled out across the country, there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't look to corporate South Africa to make contributions in that regard. But look, that is not a central plank. There are couple of thousand people who are in prison who can't afford bail. If you resolve that overnight, you'd still have a huge overcrowding problem. This is a multifaceted problem, and we need to look at that as a whole, and everyone should be working in their own sphere to reduce these problems. The judiciary included. We do have, the remedies are there. It takes a determined will to address and attack these problems, rather than just talking about it year after year. And civil society, such as organizations such as yourself, even this consciousness raising webinar is really an excellent step in the right direction. What can also be considered is litigation, which might highlight this problem or look for direct solutions. But as I indicated, litigation is not a magic bullet. It seems to me that this problem has so many facets. All these options have to be considered and addressed. I hope that answers some of the questions you raised, Dr. Bezuidenhout.
Thank you very much, Judge. Prof, some last words from your side on the same question?
Thank you very much, Doc. I want to say talking is cheap. We can have all the seminars, conference and everything, but action will assist us on solving this matter. So we have to start with action approach so that this matter can be solved. And to the foundation, in conclusion, if maybe you can be able to assist in rehabilitation program, vocational training, inmates, and the other thing, encouragement of public awareness and participation in correctional matters, including civic organization, can also be a solution towards this crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ms. Gora, some final comments from your side?
Thank you. Sorry, I've had to turn off my camera. My internet connectivity got a bit wonky. But so yeah, basically what I was some of the things I was going to suggest have already been recommended, but I think a lot of it is to just reiterate, the importance and the value of advocacy from civil society side, particularly around, but also, it's advocacy for reforms, particularly around, the bail project, as well as, the review of the parole system, as well as, just general advocacy around decriminalization. That's work that a lot of civil society organizations in the sector are already doing. And it's also to just kind of get more partners involved and to continue to also raise the awareness, not just of the general public, but also our colleagues and our partners in different sectors of civil society, because I think there can be, oftentimes we, in our fight for various issues that are more or less similar, our ideas of what the solution is kind of also sometimes differ. So for instance, you'll have certain sectors calling for harsher punishments, and calling for longer sentences and, the minimum sentences. And at the same time, you've got our sector that's also, highlighting that this is not actually doing, that is not the most effective way of addressing the issues. So I think there's a lot of dialogues like this, platforms like this, and engagement across, networks and sectors, government and civil society and academia alike. I think also continued raising awareness within the community and the public. But I think also it is about emphasizing to government, the various relevant government departments, including the Department of Social Development, I forgot to mention them earlier, that, there needs to be more investment being put in the communities themselves. So if we're talking prevention, right, we need to reduce crime and violence. And we know what the causes in crime or violence are. We know that they're not excuses, but they certainly are reasons, right? And we need to acknowledge those realities and those reasons and find and be more committed and more intentional in our holding government accountable for making sure that those reasons that become push factors are lessened, right? And then also to acknowledge that people come from these communities, return to these communities, but these same communities also have collective trauma, individual trauma. The families also have trauma. So there needs to be an inclusion of the communities in any kind of psychosocial support services that are done around incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, victims of crime, survivors of violence, etc., but also the broader community, in order to enable better reintegration, which also might contribute to the reduction of recidivism. But yeah, and also organizations can also support with availing legal services as far as possible. There are not many NGOs available now that are able to take on cases anymore because of funding. But if anybody can, even in the private sector, pro bono work, I think that's also one of the very important ways of assisting in dealing with the issue of overcrowding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gora, and to all my panelists today and to my online audience. I've seen the other comments coming in, but I think we've addressed the comments made there sufficiently for this engagement today. This is not the beginning of this discussion. It's definitely not the end. We're merely in the middle, and we've taken copious notes, and we will see as an organization with our mandate how we can take some of these matters forward within the new year. Thank you very much, and we look forward to engaging with you further on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Have a
very
great
much.
day.
Thank you.